Pomerol is one of my favorite wine regions in the entire world. As much as I enjoy visiting the large chateau on Bordeaux's left bank, there's something special about Pomerol. But I'm most often struck by what is not there. There's very few large grand chateaux. There's no tourists or visitors, and no sense of grandeur or spectacle. Just a small, quiet plateau filled with vineyards where some of the world's most profound wines are made in relative seclusion. In fact, I always get to my visits very early so that I can just drive around a little bit and spend some time there to soak it all in. I enjoyed my visit there last year so much that this year, on my most recent trip to Bordeaux, I devoted an entire day to Pomerol. So in this video, I'm going to start out with a brief overview of Pomerol and then share what I learned during my visits. Bordeaux is a massive wine region with close to 100,000 hectares planted to vine. Pomerol, however, is extremely small with less than 800 hectares planted to vine. In fact, even compared to just the right bank wine regions, you can see how tiny Pomerol is. On this map, Pomerol is number 6, and you can see neighboring Saint-Emilion, which is number 8, absolutely dwarfs it by comparison. Merlot is the dominant grape in Pomerol, and it has around 80% of the plantings. Cabernet Franc is second. While Cabernet Sauvignon is a distant third, many of the producers that I speak with are planting more and more Cabernet Sauvignon, perhaps in response to global warming and the warmer climate. Cabernet Sauvignon, being a late ripening grape, is able to ripen better now than it has been historically. While there's no classification in Pomerol, there's some extremely special wines being produced in Pomerol. In terms of flavors and aromas, I oftentimes get red and sometimes a little bit of black fruit. Plum is probably one of the most common fruit descriptors that I notice. Also, there's violets, truffles, and much more. These wines can be incredibly elegant and sensuous. Tannins can be refined and the finish long and graceful. The wines are also capable of aging effortlessly for decades. While there can be some extremely expensive wines in Pomerol, there's also some that offer extraordinary value relative to the quality, including many of the wines I'll be discussing in this video. In fact, one of the wines that I'll be featuring sells for as little as 40 euros per bottle, and in my opinion is one of the very best values in all of Pomerol. Chateau Clinet has some historic vineyards that had vines planted on them as early as 1785. In this video, I'll focus more on the recent history of Chateau Clinet, beginning in the late 1990s when new ownership acquired this historic estate. New ownership wasted no time making improvements to the wines. Among other things, they reduced the amount of new French oak used for maturation from 100% to around 60%. In the vineyard, they also embarked on a replanting program, and they used greater planting density in the vineyard. These initiatives all paid off, and the quality for Chateau Clinet improved noticeably beginning with the 2005 vintage. Better still, despite the increase in quality, pricing has remained extremely reasonable, and Chateau Clinet wines offer extremely affordable pricing relative to many Pomerol wines of comparable quality. Chateau Clinet has around 11.5 hectares of vines, and they're planted to 3/4 Merlot and 1/4 Cabernet Sauvignon. Yes, Cabernet Sauvignon, not Cabernet Franc. This is a bit unusual in Pomerol for sure. Back in 2000, there was only around 10% Cabernet Sauvignon, but another change made by the new ownership is to return the Cabernet Sauvignon percentage to its historic percentage that existed before the Great Frost of 1956. Many of the Chateau Clinet vines average around 45 years of age, but they do have some extremely special vines that were planted back in 1934 near the church and across the street from the Fleur-Petrus. This special parcel of Old Vine Merlot makes up about 20% of the Clinet vineyards, and it adds tremendous depth and quality to the blends. On occasion, they even bottle separately a small amount of wine made exclusively from these special old vines. For example, in 2009, they produced 300 bottles of a wine that's called Speciosa Seposito. The 2009 Clinet is already an extremely special wine, as that received a perfect 100-point score and is a candidate for Wine of the Vintage. So I can only imagine how mind-blowing this special bottling is that consists exclusively of these special old vines. Fortunately, during my visit, I was able to buy 3 bottles of this wine. While I haven't tasted it yet, I'm very much looking forward to it, and I'll be sure to share my notes after I taste it. In 2014, Chateau Clinet completed a renovation of its winery. Among other things, they replaced a lot of the old wooden vats used for fermentation with numerous stainless steel tanks. They now have enough stainless steel tanks to vinify their wines on a plot-by-plot basis, which is definitely the gold standard in Bordeaux and the approach used by many top wineries. Depending on the vintage, Chateau Clinet will mature in barrel for around 18 to 22 months. 60% of the barrels are new. They also use around 5% of German and Austrian oak as part of the maturation regime. Interestingly, they're also experimenting with maturation of small batches of their wines in round concrete eggs. So far, they seem to be encouraged by the results, so this may become a larger percentage of their blend on a going forward basis. Chateau Clinet's wines are rich, supple, sensuous, and powerful. If you haven't tried them yet, I highly recommend that you do so. Better still, pricing is extremely reasonable for wines of this quality. In fact, many of the new releases sell for around $100 or perhaps a little bit more. The current release of Chateau Clinet is the 2023 vintage, which I recently tasted at the winery and which was quite enjoyable. That wine is a blend that consists of 75% Merlot and 1/4 Cabernet Sauvignon. Despite its youth, it was already showing extremely well, and it kept opening up and evolving as the tasting wore on. You should also be able to track down some 2022 Clinet, which I would highly recommend as well, as that was an exceptional vintage too. In terms of prior vintages, we also tasted the 2009 and 2019 vintages at the winery, and you definitely can't go wrong with either of those, as those vintages are also 2 of my all-time favorite vintages for Clinet. In addition, you should also keep an eye out for 2010 and 2018, both of which I enjoy very much as well. If you're a fan of older vintages and want to try some of the Clinet wines with decades worth of age, definitely keep an eye out for 1989 and 1990, both of which are terrific also. Clinet also has a second wine that's called Fleur de Clinet, which in my opinion is one of the absolute best values in all of Pomerol. At the winery, I tasted the 2021 vintage, and I also tasted the 2022 vintage while I was in France as well. The 2022 vintage is definitely my favorite of those 2. That wine is a blend that consists of 95% Merlot and 5% Cabernet Sauvignon. Due to the higher percentage of Merlot and the fact that it's generally made in a more approachable style, this is a wine that's already extremely enjoyable. In fact, I enjoyed this wine so much that I drank both of my bottles in France at the hotel before I returned home. This wine is very much made in the same style as the top Clinet wine, so if you haven't tried Clinet wines yet and you'd like to get a feel for it without spending more than $100 per bottle, definitely try Fleur de Clinet first. The Fleur-Petrus is owned by the Moëx family, which also owns prestigious wineries like Petrus, Belair-Menange, and Dominus Estate, among others. The Moëx family acquired this property back in the mid-1950s. While this acquisition certainly worked out well for the Moëx family in the long run, it started off on a relatively inauspicious note, as shortly after the purchase, Pomerol was hit by the devastating Great Frost of 1956, which completely devastated the vineyards. As such, they had to do a total replant of all the vines. Over the years, the Moëx family has gradually expanded the vineyard holdings for Le Fleur-Petrus, and now they have an impressive 19 hectares of vineyards, which is an extremely large estate for Pomerol. Despite the fact that it's located essentially across the street from Petrus, Le Fleur-Petrus demonstrates just how dramatically a terroir can diverge within the tiny, compact Pomerol appellation. Unlike Petrus, which is known for having extremely concentrated blue clay soils, Le Fleur-Petrus has soils that contain much more gravel and different types of clay, extremely small amounts of the famous blue clay. The differences in soils translates to a different expression of Pomerol wine and also a different strategy in the vineyard. While Petrus is 100% Merlot, the 19 hectares of vines controlled by the Fleur-Petrus are planted to 91% Merlot, 6% Cabernet Franc, and 3% Petit Verdot, and it's extremely unusual for Petit Verdot to be planted in Pomerol. This planting mix is different from their historical approach, which was to include closer to 80% Merlot and around 20% Cabernet Franc. It's difficult to generalize about the winemaking approach used at the Fleur-Petrus because they vary the approach from vintage to vintage, depending on what the year requires. They use an extremely strict selection of fruit, and they use optical sorting equipment to assist with that selection. The Fleur-Petrus typically spends around 18 months in oak prior to bottling, but the percentage of new oak can vary from vintage to vintage, often between around 1/3 new oak and 50% new oak, depending on the requirements that particular year. The blend can also vary depending on vintage, and they have some epic tasting sessions where Christian Moex, his son, and members of the winemaking team try to determine the exact blend that they will use for that particular year. The highly acclaimed 2019 vintage, which I tasted at the winery recently, is representative. The 2019 La Fleur-Petrus is a blend that consists of 94% Merlot, 5% Cabernet Franc, and 1% Petit Verdot. Even just a splash of Petit Verdot has a big impact on the final wine, so you really don't need a lot of it, as a little bit can go a long way. Despite its youth, this wine was already extremely enjoyable and certainly has a long future ahead of it. La Fleur-Petrus is an elegant, sensuous style of Bordeaux that has the ability to age gracefully for decades. Some of my favorite vintages include 1998, 2009, 2010, 2015 and 16, and 2019 and 2020. While you may need to pay up a bit for older vintages that are more ready to enjoy, new releases can often be had for around $200 per bottle. In fact, I see that the 2023 vintage is selling for around $210 per bottle in the United States. Located in Pomerol, Conseillante is a historic producer that traces its roots way back to the 1750s. This makes it one of the oldest estates in all of Pomerol. It's also one of my favorites, in large part because it produces wines of extreme elegance and finesse. Conseillante has around 12.5 hectares of vines. These vines have historically been planted to 80% Merlot and 20% Cabernet Franc. Recently, however, Conseillante has been increasing the percentages of Cabernet Franc, and they even planted a parcel of Cabernet Sauvignon that could be utilized in the wine as early as 2025. So going forward, we can expect that the blend for Conseillante will be 70% Merlot, around 25% Cabernet Franc, and perhaps 5% of Cabernet Sauvignon. The Conseillante vines are located in a prestigious area, as its neighbors include Chateau Petrus and L'Avangile. Interestingly, around 30% of Conseillante's vines are located in Saint-Emilion near Cheval Blanc. Conseillante has been using some sustainable farming techniques and gradually converting to organic principles. Every year, a larger percentage of its vines are farmed organically. Conseillante completed a massive renovation of its winery in time for the 2012 vintage. They have a unique circular-shaped winery. They also added a number of concrete vats back then, and this allows them to use parcel-by-parcel vinification, which gives them more precision with their winemaking. Interestingly, Conseillante has also been experimenting with vinifying some of their wine in oak barrels. This started with 6% or so back in 2015, and they were pleased with the results, so they've increased this to around 9% or so. It seems like this vinification in oak gives them a little bit more texture in the wines. Conseillante's wines are typically matured in 70% new French oak, 27% of barrels that have one previous use, and around 3% in amphora. Interestingly, Conseillante is one of the very few right bank producers that blends shortly after malolactic fermentation is completed and long before bottling. As mentioned, the thing I really love about the Conseillante wines is that they're wines of elegance and finesse, with silky tannins and velvety texture. These are not the most powerful wines in Pomerol, nor the ripest, but they're perhaps the most elegant and well-balanced. These are extremely sensuous wines, and wines that you definitely have to taste if you haven't done so previously. Conseillante wines typically include flavors and aromas of black cherry, black raspberry, plum, and violets. In fact, this violet descriptor is so well established that Conseillante even has a violet color on its label. Conseillante has been absolutely firing on all cylinders lately. Some of my favorite vintages for Conseillante include 2015, 2016, 2018, 19, and 20. But perhaps two of my absolute favorite vintages are 2022 and 2023. The 2022 vintage should be hitting store shelves soon, and this is a potentially triple 100-point wine. They absolutely crushed it in 2022. This wine will sell for a little bit more than some other vintages of Conseillante, but I think it will be well worth it in the long run. I've seen this one selling for around $300 a bottle or so in the United States. The 2023 vintage is also a potentially perfect wine. I had a chance to get an early read on this wine during my recent visit to the winery. And you can find this one selling on futures for quite a bit less than the 2022 vintage. This one will be closer to $200 or so. But again, it's a wine that I highly recommend. If you're looking for older vintages of Conseillante, some of my favorites include 1990, which was absolutely phenomenal, and 1998. I've also had some mixed results with the 2020 vintage. That one was previously a little bit closed and shut down, but about 6 months ago, this wine seemed to turn a corner a little bit, and some of the more recent bottles that I've tasted have been much more vibrant and expressive, and they appear to be emerging from their slumber. 2023 Bordeaux is rolling out onto store shelves now. If you'd like to learn more about this excellent vintage and some of the wines that I recommend, please be sure to watch this video that's linked above.